Hi there, I'm Diogo Alagador, a researcher at University of Évora in Portugal, and I am delighted to be part of the Humboldt Day celebration, where I will share with you some studies using biogeographical principles to respond to modern-day conservation challenges. I hope that you may enjoy this. Thank you.
In the last 10,000 years, the world has been dominated by a sole species, Homo sapiens. The first irreversible fingerprints of human influence over nature occur by that time, with overhunting contributing to the extinction of several mammal species. From there to these days, a large number of species have been extinguished, traversing every taxonomic group and driven by several factors. Habitat loss has been the main one in the last years. Indeed, human prevalence along the planet may be seen by very different forms. For example, from urban centers to roads to impacts over landscapes, from the spread of invasive species to expansion of agriculture and the decline of primary forests. Still, there are some places that are more or less pristine. They are wild places, but they are decreasing. And a significant part of the planet is enclosed within protected areas, but their connectivity is also decreasing. These conservation efforts have risen up in the current century, with many conservation NGOs delivering maps of important areas for protection, given different criteria, for example, endemism, functional value, taxonomic importance, evolutive potential, for example. These different views of what is biodiversity and what deserves protection is actually a natural reflection of the cross-scaling definition and multidimensional definition of biodiversity. Actually, ecoregions are biodiversity. Species, number of species, defines levels of biodiversity, functional groups, phylogenetic lines, ecosystem services. Actually, the energy that drives the ecological processes may be seen as parts of biodiversity, and that therefore merits conservation. These patterns are actually being currently threatened or changed basically by the effect of the dynamics of climate change. Actually, as we have seen here, we can see here, climate is changing mainly through the last 50 years since the end of the World War II. Basically, climate change has a diverse array of impacts over planets, and one of the most stressing impacts over planets are environmental ones. For example, climate change might be responsible, may be responsible of habitat destruction, for example, with the ecosystem collapse, biodiversity loss. Is also the main reason of coral bleaching, for example, sea level rise, that actually then goes into coastal submersion of mangroves, for example, and salt marshes. So basically, these very many complexities associated to the development of modern societies, the dynamics surrounding climate change, and the numerous biodiversity features and processes in need of protection and or assistance makes complex the decisions about where, when, and how to distribute conservation efforts. These challenges makes actually the modern day conservation trilemma, which, in order to be more or less solved or built, needs powerful analytical tools to support decisions. And therefore, it's something that deserves a further and deeper approach in the upcoming years. As we have seen, conservation problems are characterized by a series of different components, each one with its own requirements that sometimes conflict with the requirements of the other components. For example, sometimes options to conserve a given species may not be the best ones to conserve other species, or ecosystem functions or climate adaptation actions, for example. Hardly because one choice is likely to favor all the components of the conservation system, and even if this occurs, because such favorability, mutual favorability, may be obtained at different levels and at different costs for each of the components, trade-offs need to be made by opting to give large priority to some components of the system. Basically, the spatial dimension of conservation planning, so where to locate protected areas, for example, depends on maps divided by several thousands of grid cells, characterizing several hundreds or thousands of ecological entities in various time periods. And because of this, the solution space for a problem where one wants to locate protected areas in order to maximize the ecological benefits with the lowest costs or the lowest competing interests with other socioeconomic activities are explosive and needs very much mathematical support. There are actually some general problems in optimization that are well suited to describe the basic concerns of conservation planning. For example, in the minimum set cover problem, the idea is to define a minimum number of areas or areas of minimum costs where all species that are under analysis need to be represented in 1, 2, 3, 4 grid cells, for example. So these targets are defined for each of the species. Similarly, in the maximum cover problem, the idea is to maximize the number of species represented in the system, but given a limited and fixed budget. So we have a given fixed resource for the selection of areas, and we want the set of areas that maximize the representation of species. Commonly, this type of approaches does not have any kind of special characterization. So basically, they define areas more or less randomly located in space. But actually, there are problems that can be very much mathematical represented that enters with special requirements, and that then defines areas that are more or less clustered or linked or more or less close by one each other, and that may be best suited for conservation purposes. In the pin median problem, the idea is to define among a set of areas, P areas, that for which the distance of the other areas to the closest focal area is minimized. This is, for example, a problem that is well suited for the identification of the areas of the P areas that represent at the maximum variability of the environment of a given region, for example. A different types of problems concerns about connectivity. Connectivity means that areas need to be continuous, so to define more or less straight paths of adaptation or of transfer of individuals, energy, or matter, for example. In the minimum cost path, the idea is to identify the path or the set of contiguous areas that of minimum cost that links two spatial areas, so the source and the target area. Similarly, in the minimum spanning tree problem, the goal is to identify a set of areas that define a continuous path that links all spatial areas, in this case, for example, clusters, all together, clusters of species or spatial habitats or patches of habitats, for example. Another type of problems concerns with uncertainties. And so under an uncertainty scenario, what we want actually is to minimize the variability or to maximize the robustness of our solutions. For example, if we have a series of scenarios which each one linked with an expected ecological benefit, the idea is to define which scenarios should be given priority in regarding to the others, depending actually on their characterizing uncertainty and the expected value that those scenarios give in terms of ecological benefit. And finally, there is a kind of very general problem, one that intends to maximize the persistence of the species or the ecological entities under analysis, and actually it goes deep into the art of the conservation, because the idea is to define the areas that maximize the persistence of ecological entities through time. Next, I will present 3 studies which endorse part of the conservation trilemma, but each one having a proper perspective about biodiversity conservation. This first analysis was undertaken for a small agroforestry region in southwestern Portugal, where many small private properties exist with a subsistence agriculture activities. Actually, this is one of the few regions in the world where Quercus canariensis actually still occurs, and is taken as a subspecies of Quercus virginia that overcame the last glaciation in the southern part of Iberian Peninsula. So the main goal of this study was to use environmental factors as surrogates of conservation value for the protection of biodiversity in a context of climate change. So we first identified the freshest areas in the region, either in present time and future time, basically. So either in present and future time, we identify 50% of the region with the freshest temperatures. And then we overlaid those time periods, and we got an area that is likely to maintain fresh temperatures a long time. Next, we also identify the slopes that are exposed to the northern faces slopes, and western faces slopes. So the first ones, the northern ones, are the ones that are expected to be least affected by sun exposure, while the western side slopes are the ones that are expected to receive the marine breezes and fogs that are typical in these regions, especially at the morning in summertime. We also looked into the variability in terms of topography of the region. So basically here in the lower maps, we see what are the regions here that have most variability in terms of elevation. So we choose the top 25 areas with the highest variability of topography. Then we overlaid these two informations and we got the areas that are either facing north or western sides, and also that present large topographic complexities. We also looked into the protected areas by law in the region that are Natura 2000 sites. And basically, by taking the information, the previous information in terms of thermal stability, the slope and the topography, and with the Natura 2000 sites, we identified the areas that having all these four factors in common are defined as climate refugia. For the other areas that have no the four factors, we also establish a gradient of attractability for a climate connectivity in the region. So basically, for example, for regions with the climate stability, north and western side slopes and topographic heterogeneity, but without Natura 2000 sites, we defined a cost of one. So areas that are very attractive for connectivity because they only fail in terms of Natura 2000 sites. For example, areas that have two of the previous factors, so basic climate stability in terms of the exposure of slopes and topographic heterogeneity, if they have two of these previous and Natura sites, they have a cost of two. So they are not the most attractive areas, but they are okay to be used for climatic connectivity. So basically we have here a map with these costs or gradients of attractability for the definition of climate connectivity in the regions to link these green areas that are the refugia here. So basically we use then a solver for the minimum spanning tree, and we could afford to get the connectivity areas with the highest attractability that link all the refugia in the region. But we try to avoid, for example, very lengthy connectivity lines. So basically we deleted from the solution the lines with over 2 kilometers extension, and therefore we get 3 clusters of individualized refugia. Basically, we see that each of these clusters is not linked to the other ones, but inside actually all the refugia are linked. And so we can here have a better view in terms of the refugia in this region here, in the southern part of the study region, and we then tried to enlarge a bit these connectivity areas. So basically this set of areas constitutes the backbone of a green infrastructure that is now being negotiated with the authorities and also with the private owners for the conservation of biodiversity in the region, while also to maintain their sustained activities as they have been doing in the last years. Contrary to the previous study, the second one deals with the species-specific nature of adaptive responses to climate change. So basically, with climate change, species may either adapt locally in situ through physiological behavior or evolutionary processes, or when this is not possible, species need to endure spatial rearrangements following their moving suitable climates. So the dynamics imposed by climate change over species distributions go against the static nature of protected areas. For example, if a protected area, it is this green triangle here, then when climate change, species tends to go to follow their suitable climates and in sometimes many species also occurring in protected areas may lose protection. So in order to protected areas to be effective under dynamical contexts, then basically it could be a good idea to define protected spots where the species are likely to be in future times. So this encloses some type of dynamism and flexibility, while still needing to confine protected areas in order to minimize the conflicts with the other land uses. So in these types of assessments, SDMs, or species distribution models, or bioclimatic niche models, are critical tools to perspective the future distributions of species. Basically, these models relate the occurrence of species with local climate properties, then infer the climatic conditions more suitable for a species, basically in different times. So they use different functions to relate the climate where the species occurs with the occurrence of the species. That's why there are many different types of SDMs. And therefore, with this information, it is possible to predict where the suitable climates for the species will be in another parts of a map that were not sampled, or in a future time, for example. With this information regarding the climatic suitability of the species and the knowledge regarding dispersal requirements of species, it is possible to infer and evaluate routes of adaptation, and using them as conservation units with an intuitive ecological appeal. For example, here we call adaptive trajectory a set of grid cells. One grid cell in a map defines a given time period. And then it is possible for each adaptive trajectory to define a persistence metric of a species within the trajectory, using the suitability scores derived from the SDMs in each grid cell in different time periods in the trajectory, and also the likelihood of successful dispersal of the species between these different grid cells along time. So the persistence in a given adaptive trajectory is zero either when one cell is unsuitable for the species in any time period in analysis, or when it is not possible for a species to disperse from one grid cell to another one, either because of the other grid cell is too far away compared to the dispersal capability of the species, or because there are environmental barriers, for example, in between these areas that avoid inputs the dispersal of the species and the successful colonization of the target grid cell. So therefore, for each species, there are commonly a large number of possible trajectories that needs to be assessed in order to deliver and to infer the likelihood of the species to persist in those areas, and to put them in context with the current and future properties of the areas where these trajectories will occur, basically. So here we have, for example, different types of trajectories. Here, for example, we have an analysis for 4 time periods, and a trajectory here is defined by these 4 grid cells. Each grid cell is just respecting a given time period, and the species is dispersing from one to the other one. Here, for example, the species uses the same grid cell in T0 and T1, and then it crosses from T1 to T2, and then from T2 to the T3. So basically, these 3 grid cells define an adaptive trajectory also for the species. For example, actually, the case of a species being in the same grid cell over the time is actually a type of trajectory. So basically the species is in T0 here, then it disperses year to year from T0 to T1, and the same in between all the different time periods in assessment. So basically this also defines, for example, the adaptive trajectory for a species that is able to cross or to have a very broad dispersal requirements. So basically the species passes from T0 to T1 while not needing actually to use the contiguous cells close by. So we tested these adaptive trajectories for 13 animal species in Europe to identify well where will be those trajectories, delivering the largest persistence for expectancies for the species, and what are the land uses, the habitat condition, and the protective status of the areas where those trajectories are likely to pass over. So this is the stage of our analysis. So we have the coverage of each grid cell in terms of Natura 2000 sites, the same for protected areas. We have also the human footprint index that basically measures the habitat disturbance in each grid cell. So it goes from 0 to very pristine regions to 100 that are very disturbed regions in Europe. So basically we can see here that the greenest areas are correlated with urban centers in Europe. Then we have also used a classification of land uses in terms of urban areas, arable areas, pasture lands, forest lands, and croplands. And we have actually used this for current time and based on models that have projections for the evolution and trajectories of the land uses into future time, and that are matching the different climate change scenarios. So, for example, for the Iberian Lynx, here we have, for example, the distribution of persistence scores in the top ranked trajectories. And here in blue, for example. And these persistence scores, I remember that the maximum is 1. So basically, actually, for the length, the persistence is not very good, even in the best ranked trajectories. So these best trajectories are compared to the persistence if the species would just be in the areas that are likely to be the most climatic suitable for the species a long time. So basically, this assumes no dispersal capability for the species, and this assumes the dispersal capability for the species. We can see the change. So if the species would be able to move, so the persistence expectancies would be much lower when compared to scenarios where the species is able to move within their best or top persistence trajectories. So here we can see, for example, that the top trajectories, the almost 400 top trajectories for the Iberian Lynx is located here in the southwestern Portugal. And as we can see, if we sum the persistence of all the trajectories, in this case 357 trajectories, we have only 32 units of persistence. So basically this defines almost 9% of the potential persistence of the species that is inside the best adaptive trajectories for the length. And here below we have the relationship between the persistence in all the almost 400 trajectories of the length with the different land properties. For example, we can see for most of the land classification measures that we have analyzed, there is a negative relationship. So basically here, for land uses, this means that the best persistence adaptive trajectories for the Iberian Lynx are in areas with low coverage in urban areas, in arable areas, grasslands, forests, and mainly with the highest negative relationship with cropland. The same with the human footprint here. Basically, we can see that the highest persistence adaptive trajectories relates with regions with low disturbance levels here. So basically here, and the same is basically is a kind of difference actually. For protected areas, we have this negative relationship is not so marked, and so basically there are no clear evidence relationship between the persistence of the trajectories for the Iberian Lynx and the coverage in Natura 2000, or actually in protected areas. So we have here where are the best 500 trajectories for the 30 species in Europe. So the color means how many species is using each grid cell for a trajectory. So linking current time to 2080, for example. Here below we can see the richness in terms of the 30 species in Europe, so there is no any clear relationship between these two maps. And here we have the percentage of each land use factor that we have assessed that is covered by these adaptive trajectories for the 30 species. Basically we can see, for example, that about 15% of all pasture land in Europe will be covered or will be used for these species as good trajectories for climatic adaptation. So we have here the persistence of each of the species. So I remember that previously we have seen the Iberian Lynx with almost 9% of the potential persistence within its top-ranked adaptive trajectories, but here we have the same evaluation for all the 30 species in analysis. So basically we can see here that European otter, the best trajectories actually are very good in terms of climatic suitability and dispersal success. And actually it is not so much, there is no so much variation when we varied the RCPs, so basically the climate change scenarios and the dispersal curves we used for in order to summarize the different potential of the species to disperse. And here, for example, we have the percentage of the persistence in the top ranked adaptive trajectories that occurs inside Natura 2000 sites and protected areas. Here we can see actually that, well, the results are not so optimistic. For example, we can see that only about 7 species, or 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species, Natura 2000 sites cover more than 10% of the persistence in their best climatic trajectories. And the scenario is even worse, so is worser when we look into protected areas. So basically only 3 species will have in protected areas covering more than 10% of the persistence in their top suitable climatic trajectories. So this third study basically integrates the climate mitigation perspective of conservation inside the biodiversity conservation plan. So basically the aim of this study is to assess the spatial relationship between the value of biodiversity and the carbon sinks all over the planet, in order to identify basically where are the win-win areas. So basically areas that are good in terms of carbon fixation and also good in terms of biodiversity values. However, as we may see here, climate mitigation may be endorsed by different means. So basically one of the first approaches advocated climate mitigation were based on biofuels. So basically the idea was to plant several types of species, most species with oils, over extensive regions. So basically these are very homogeneous regions without any type of biodiversity values that were seen as good in terms of climate mitigation, because the carbon fixation in those areas were seen as okay. Actually, there are also attempts to replace grasslands or savannas by forests, also mostly by monocultures. So basically, in this case, the principle is to put forests and therefore to increase carbon fixations through photosynthesis, but overlooking actually the value of the soil of these regions in terms of conservation of carbon sinks. And so basically, most of these attempts also are not good in terms of carbon fixation, and actually have an high ecological impact because they transform abruptly the habitats they're in. So basically, the most nature-based climate mitigation approaches that are looked as better in terms of conservation planning are based on protection of areas like peatlands here, or old growth forests, or salt marshes, or mangroves. For example, that are regions with a very high capacity for the fixation of carbon. So basically here we see the potential of carbon sinkage in the soil and vegetation all over the world. So basically we can see here that carbon hotspots are mostly located in coastal lagoons, in peatlands, in tundra, and in parts of tropical forests, especially here in Southeastern Asia. So basically here we have an overview of what is biodiversity, depending on endemism, on number of species, also depending on the condition of the habitat. So basically here we see as a kind of proactive conservation value, because actually the habitat condition in these areas that are good in terms of endemic species, and in terms of threatened species, and in terms of some types of ecosystems, and there are in good condition. So the idea is to protect, if we protect these areas, we are doing it in areas that are already good, so we try to avoid the degradation of the areas. And if we assume that biodiversity has this pattern all over the world, we can then relate this biodiversity measure with the carbon potential, for the carbon fixation potential that we saw previously, and we have this type of map. So the reddish area are areas that are good for these biodiversity metrics, and also good for carbon fixation, as we can see. Basically, the northern regions here are very marked, because actually these are regions with high value in terms of proactive conservation, as we can see here, because they are almost pristine areas. If we look into biodiversity in terms of reactive terms, basically meaning that, okay, these areas are very important for endemisms, for the protection of threatened species, but actually they are areas where habitat is in poor condition. So this can be seen as a kind of reactive conservation value of areas here, as we can see. And we also can relate this biodiversity vision with the climatic mitigation potential of the soils therein. And we can see here also an overlap of the two maps here. And here we have, so basically the 20% best areas in terms of these two visions of biodiversity, either the proactive one and the reactive one here, you can see here. And then we can also overlap this information with the 20% of areas with the highest carbon fixation potential. So we can see here the regions that are very good, so they are win-win areas, but with great quality for the protection of the proactive biodiversity, the green areas, and the protection of the reactive biodiversity, the reddish areas here. So basically, these areas may actually not so cover the full gradient of biodiversity that needs protection. There is therefore the need to look not only for the win-win areas, as we have saw in the previous slide, but also for the areas where either are not very good for biodiversity, but are good for climate mitigation, or the areas that are good for biodiversity or not very good for climate mitigation. And so actually in this perspective, conservation planning that depends on these two types of areas enters in a trade-off analysis. And trade-off analysis is basically well represented in this curve, where we see here the solutions that are the best ones, that are the best at least for one type of the factor in analysis, in this case for one factor, and which the improvement if one factor means the declining quality of the other one. So basically a decision then may see, for example, if it is worthwhile to assume that this solution is best than this one, because for example here the climate mitigation potential actually is not so much different, while the gain in biodiversity is much bigger than the one in climate mitigation potential. So basically this is the term, the types of analysis that are endorsed in these climate mitigation approaches integrated in conservation planning. So to sum up, so basically the idea of this presentation was basically to give you an overview about the challenges that characterize modern day conservation planning. So these challenges are based on the complexities that are associated to the system, which is part of the conservation actions. So basically this system is made of different types of biodiversity, so basically not only about species, but also about ecosystem functions and also about ecosystem services, actually, and different types of biodiversity also depending on the functional value and also of the phylogenetic and evolutive potential. So we need also to integrate the human development, basically calling for sustainable development and sustainable activities in different areas, and this can be instigated with new market rules and new legislation that is being developed mostly in developed world. So we need also to integrate climate change action, because climate change is a reality that is challenging very much conservation planning, as we see, because climate change is very dynamic. Conservation planning has been, but needs not to be, very static. So basically the idea in climate change is to endorse climate change adaptation of the biodiversity elements and also about people, why not, and give also very much attention to nature-based climate change mitigation approaches, like afforestation in sites, in areas where actually there is likely to be a real gain on carbon sinkage, and basically and the enrichment also of soils without actually impacting negatively biodiversity therein. So basically the new conservation science needs actually to have these types of properties. So it should be science driven, should be heavy analytical. Unfortunately, this is something that needs to be done because of the complexity, all the complexities and the optimization that we need to endorse in the solutions that we are proposing. needs also to be flexible, adaptive, and self-learning and dynamical because of the context of the dynamics in the environment, needs also to be cross-scaling, not only in terms of biodiversity of ecological elements, but also in terms of the coordination of actions either at local, regional, continental, or global scales. Needs also to be intersectorial, so touching the arts of many, many different players. Need also to be integrative because needs also to enter with other types of knowledge, even scientific knowledge, for example, with genetics, with DNA science, with geology, with paleontology, and with climate change scientists also. And also needs also to look for harmonized solutions, so solutions that at least are accepted by all the players therein. So the new conservation science is not only based in fieldwork, which is good, it is not also only based on desk work, but also needs to enter with workshops, with lab work, with classrooms in terms of education, and peer reviewing communication, actually, in order for any type of protocols to be assessed in terms of scientific quality. So to finalize, the idea here is to show that conservation nowadays needs to face motivated players, and especially involving decision makers in order to act in the favor of biodiversity that tends to be the poor element of all the planetary system. So actually acting with motivated decision makers, it can make all the scientific proposals, all the concerns raised by stakeholders, and all the solutions delivered by big data science, basically with large algorithms and with adaptive learning techniques, in order to make all these efforts unified in real-world aptitudes to make those investments in conservation effective and basically to make biodiversity to persist into the future. So basically, that's all. I hope that you could enter into the trilemmas of biodiversity conservation, and please be free to contact me if you have any correction to make on my presentation, or if you need any kind of assistance or clarification. So thank you for your patience, and enjoy all the Humboldt Day celebration here in this site. Thank you very much.